Hello, my name is Miki Zaharula and I will present problem 8, soap membrane filter. The problem to be investigated was that a heavy particle may fall through a horizontal soap film without rupturing it. However, a light particle may not penetrate the film but remain on its surface, and we were called to investigate the properties of such a membrane filter. By definition, a soap membrane filter is a liquid membrane that acts like a reverse filter, allowing only large objects through while blocking the small ones. In its simplest form, the membrane can be created with water and a substance that stabilizes the interface between liquid and air, and has a structure similar to that of a biological cell membrane. In this study, the material used is soap. A constantly water membrane can last up to 3 hours. It blocks small objects that gather in one area of the membrane, and instead of using holes in the membrane for separation, it uses the object's kinetic energy. So if an object develops a high kinetic energy, it will pass through the membrane. However, if it maintains a low kinetic energy, it will only be retained. More in depth in this problem, we see that a freestanding membranes composed entirely of liquid and soap can be designed to retain particles smaller than a critical size, given the particle inertial properties. The membrane itself only allows heavy and big objects through due to its properties, which are the self-healing properties a membrane has, and the two surface membrane apatize by hydrophobic and hydrophilic ends. Basically, how all this happens is through a process called endocytosis, which is a procedure in which substances are brought into the cell. Said membrane is based on the form of cell membranes. This is why we use endocytosis to describe the phenomenon. We change the concentration in the liquid, and thus the object passes through the membrane. The reason why the membrane does not rupture when an object passes through has to do with the self-healing properties that are created by the need for lowest energy consumption possible. So the membrane always wants to return in the state where it needed less energy, and that it is its previous state. Each time a body falls through the membrane, the liquid opens and closes around said object in a very short amount of time. During that phase, the object has broken the bonds between the hydrophobic ends in the membrane, exposing them to the liquid around them, and prevents them from forming that bond again. When the particle exits the membrane, thanks to its kinetic energy, the hydrophobic ends inch closer together until the bond is formed and stable again. A change in concentration of the liquid also occurs the moment the object comes in contact with the membrane, which has two surfaces. As the object exerts a force F on the membrane surface, said surface exerts the same force on the particles in the liquid between the two surfaces, causing the liquid to move towards the sides of the membrane. Thus, the two surfaces near one another, and as a result, the pressure point becomes really thin, making it easier for the object to pass through and the membrane to self-heal. The water molecules can cast an attractive force, not just on those closest to them, but on the other water molecules around them, and that is called the surface tension. Water retains from allowing light objects to pass through the surface, and is able to keep a relatively stable form, all thanks to the molecular attractions. Surface tension is the attractive force found in liquids, which is responsible for pulling surface molecules in the rest of the liquid. Further, it minimizes the surface area. The attractive forces we are talking about here are because of electrostatic forces, which are attractive or repulsive forces between particles that are caused by their electric charges. Thus, they enable the water surface to produce a tight-knit cohesive unit. The surface tension is the attractive force found in liquids, which also minimizes the surface area. As we can see in the picture, all the molecules cast the same attractive force to those around them, except the ones at the top, which creates the tight cohesive unit. On the surface of the liquid, these molecules do not pull up at all, due to the fact that no molecules are there for them to pull on. The molecules are pulled down by a strong force between them. Thus, it makes a solid obstacle at the liquid-gas interface. A lot of force will be required to break through the liquid surface in comparison to going through it. Capillary action is the ability of a liquid to follow in narrow spaces without the assistance of, or even in opposition to, external forces like gravity. The membrane holds onto the hoop without the need of other forces. In fluid dynamics, the capillary number represents the relative effect of viscous drag forces versus surface tension forces acting across an interface between a liquid and a gas or between two immiscible liquids. For example, an air bubble in a liquid tends to be deformed by the friction of the liquid flow due to the viscosity effects, but the surface tension forces tend to minimize the surface. Now about the held back particles. There are light objects that gather in one place on the membrane. They behave that way because of the liquid's tendency to pull more strongly on the surrounding liquid that has a lower surface tension. So the presence of the gradient and the surface tension cause the particles to follow the water as it glides on the membrane surface towards the region with low surface tension. This is a depiction of the phenomenon in comparison to a solid substrate. Now moving on to the experiments. The initial hypotheses were that big and heavy objects will pass through the membrane, the light ones will gather at one place, objects with extremely low kinetic energy won't be able to pass through the membrane, and lastly, objects with sudden shape changes will rupture the membrane as they attempt to pass through it. The materials we used were bubble soap to create the membrane, the bubble wand with a radius of 3 cm, and a timer. The different objects we used for each set of experiments were small plastic balls of a radius of 1 mm, screws, and pencils. Here's the table for the first experiment. We calculated the height and then we got a video with a tracker app and it got us the velocity and the kinetic energy. As the height increases, we can see that velocity and kinetic energy proportionally increase as well. So for the third experiment was conducted using screws. The general hypothesis was that only the rapidly changing shape screws would rupture the membrane. The second hypothesis was that only the completely straight-shaped ones were able to pass through. However, that original hypothesis was disproved when even the straight screws ruptured the membrane. We also conducted an additional experiment. After experimenting with the bigger parts of the pencil scraps, it was observed that due to their shape, the scraps would never pass the membrane no matter how big or heavy they were, due to the lack of high kinetic energy. Since the kinetic energy is proportional to velocity, passing the membrane would be impossible to rupture or let it pass as the pencil scraps can't develop such a high kinetic velocity. In additional use, other than separating particles, the membrane also has antibacterial and odor neutralizing as well as water desalination properties. For the conclusions, the big and heavy objects can pass through the filter without bursting it. The screws or any other similar object can't pass through without rupturing the membrane. Objects with low velocity and kinetic energy won't pass through no matter what the size is, and the hypotheses were proven to be correct. Thank you for your attention.